We'll say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random.
Randomness is a process that usually averages out to be the same. So most functions, random functions on a computer, if you plot them up on a graph, you can't predict which point is going to be next. But if you take a whole bunch of them and you average them, then you see that they average out to zero. And secondly, if you just think of other randomness, like perhaps quantum randomness, which is also sometimes used to try to explain free will, well, quantum randomness has a specific probability distribution. That probability distribution is the same over time. So that doesn't help you with free will either. So on that point, I would agree. Like, randomness doesn't solve the problem of free will. But there is more than that. So what exactly is freedom? So freedom, actual freedom, would be not that you just can't decide, or you can decide what point is going to be next, but not the one overall, which would be much like a game where you have a whole bunch of decisions you can make, but in the end, the outcome is always the same. So that's not it. What it would be like is if even the distribution is unpredictable, is completely unpredictable in that sense. So if you imagine just a whole bunch of atoms moving not randomly but freely, then one of them perhaps would be oscillating, another one would be moving one way and then suddenly turn and move another way. Another one would just keep going straight, and if you try to see a pattern between them, you won't really find a pattern between them. Maybe you will find some of them that are grouped together, they act similar to each other, and then you will find another group and another group, and there probably would be a couple of groups like that. And what that would be like is personality theory. This is exactly what we humans are like. We are not predictable in the sense of like randomness. We are free in the sense that we actually do have different types of personalities. You can't just average us out and then predict where we are going, even in the long term. The key thing to remember here is that this complete unpredictability is not caused by something external, it's caused by the self. So there is no external thing causing it, it's the self causing it, it's a decision. That's the difference between a decision and a random fluctuation. Now, how is it that such unpredictability is free, even if it is self-caused? Wouldn't that just be even more random than randomness itself? Well, I would say no, and that's because free will is not the only power that the self has. The other one is consciousness, and the consciousness is the thing that informs us. Free will is the power where it goes from the self outwards. Consciousness is the power where it goes from the outside world inwards. So we become informed of all the possible decisions we can make, and after that, we freely decide. That's what truly makes free will free.
If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind or inside your brain or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action.
Fully agree. If it's something external that's causing us to act, then obviously there is no free will there. This is why I think that free will and materialism are completely incompatible with each other. However, what I don't see is people questioning both sides. Usually when this discussion comes up, a discussion about free will, what tends to happen is that people will take a look at free will and criticize that and that only, and they will never actually attempt to think if perhaps the framework that they are using to understand the world should be modified. In Jean Piaget's theory, there is assimilation as well as accommodation. So assimilation is where you use a framework, and when a new thing comes up, you try to fit that new thing into the framework and understand it. So an example of that would be, let's say if my knowledge, my whole knowledge was just with the numbers 2, 4, and 8, and I find a number such as 16, I can say, okay, so 16 is 2 8s, or 16 is 4 4s, or 16 is 8 2s. And so I assimilate the knowledge to the framework. The opposite happens when something doesn't fit into the framework. So, for example, I only know 2, 4, and 8, and the next number I see is a 3. Now, what I can try and do is think that, well, maybe I can fit it in somewhere. And obviously, at this point I can't, because this is quite a simple framework. But if it was complex enough, you can imagine people saying that, maybe one day, maybe just one day, we don't know it yet, we don't understand it yet, but one day we will understand that. One day we will find a way to fit that knowledge into this framework. And that's a big problem, because it could be that not the knowledge that is false, but the framework that is false. And this is usually also the problem when it comes to studying consciousness, because consciousness is completely misunderstood. There has been no real progress in understanding it through a materialist's lens. And there is a big problem with that, because why has nobody questioned the framework? If we keep studying and studying and studying, and we see no possibility of explaining subconscious subjective experience, like it's not in the photons, because the photons are just vibrations, they hit our eye and they transform to neural activity anyway, so neither the photons have color, nor does the neural activity have color. Where is it? It doesn't seem to be in any possible place. It doesn't fit to the framework. However, nevertheless, nobody questions that. Everybody is desperately trying to fit it in and shove it into the framework. And they go so far as some people just saying that maybe consciousness doesn't even exist, but maybe free will doesn't exist. Well, I don't think that's the right attitude to take. I think if we find something, and we do have that something, we have direct evidence of consciousness. Am I conscious now? Yes, I am. Every other person can say the same. When I make a decision, do I feel that? Of course I do. Of course I feel like I'm making a decision. So why is that evidence not treated as all the other types of evidence? It seems like it's a type of reductionistic mindset trying to desperately fit the new knowledge into the existing framework. We already had such a problem before, and that was when imaginary numbers first came up. Nobody wanted to accept imaginary numbers initially, just like nobody wanted to accept quantum physics initially, because that completely broke the system. It broke the framework, and there is a resistance to this framework, to changing the framework. We would like to think that we know everything, but we don't. If there was an equal debate on both sides of the argument, debating whether we should assimilate it or accommodate it, I would have no problem with that. But the fact that nobody thinks about accommodating their framework to fit the new types of knowledge tells me that there is a very strong bias, that there is a very strong and desperate will or desire to not change it. And I think there's a very obvious reason for why that is. I mean, if you just think about some kind of a new particle, maybe if you ask any atheist if maybe, next year we will discover a new particle that we never seen before, is that plausible? And they would probably say, yeah, that's quite reasonable. But then if we ask them, do you think that perhaps we would need to modify our framework to account for free will or consciousness, they will be much more skeptical of that. And the reason for that is, I think, that it has a big impact on our life. If there is free will, you're guilty of things. If there is no free will, then there is no such a thing as a guilt other than the feeling, but you're not actually guilty of anything. Every good thing that you ever did is thanks to you, and every bad thing that you ever did is because of you. And that's how it is in a free will universe. It's no wonder that people are very resistant to try and change this framework.
If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control.
I don't agree with the internal cause argument at all. And I think Ben actually gives the exact answer that I would give. So take a look at that.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self. Right? I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer.
If you're going to try to tackle the internal consistency of free will, then you have to take into consideration that materialism can't be the answer. So why is Alex trying to deconstruct the self into different bits? The self, from the free will perspective, is an indivisible thing. It's a fundamental axiom that can't be divided.
The deciding being is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision-making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision-making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible.
I think it's a bit of a shame because I don't think they take that point far enough in this discussion, because they just go off and speak about something else because Ben just says that he believes in it and he just has faith in it, which I don't think is a satisfying enough conclusion. But his idea of an uncaused decision maker, the self being an uncaused decision maker, it's not unintelligible, although I would change that one word. It's not uncaused but self-caused, as I've described in my definition, because there is a cause, and the cause is the self. It's not that there is no cause whatsoever. There is always a cause for something. However, that is as unintelligible as is the concept of causation itself. Why does he expect an explanation for something that's axiomatic? Axioms, by definition, have no explanations. It's like, how would you explain causation? Like material causation. There is no explaining that. How does one thing cause another thing? So let's say two balls collide. One hits another and it moves. But why? Why does that happen? You could say, okay, there is a transfer of energy, but why is there a transfer of energy? How does it happen? How does causation happen? It just does. It's just something we accept. It's an axiom. And in the same way, free will is an axiom. Anything that is not within a system, something that goes outside of a system, is usually either an axiom or based on an axiom that is not within the system. Because if it wasn't an axiom, then you could just explain it with whatever you have within that system. So what would have to be true for free will to exist? It would have to be something outside of the materialist system. Materialism is incompatible with it. So for free will to exist, materialism would have to be false. The system would have to be extended. The framework, the knowledge framework, would have to add another element, another axiom to its collection, and that axiom would be a kind of free will. But the free will itself is not a thing. This is why in the definition I gave, I specifically called it a power, because it is a power, like causation is a power. An atom is a thing, and an atom can cause something else to move. But the causation itself is not a thing, is a power. It's something that an atom just can do. And as far as we can see, everything has some kind of causation, except that the free will causation is free. It's not random. It's not deterministic. It's free. It's a different type of causation. What we would really need to bring in is the self. There is a self that is conscious, that has free will. So it has the two powers, much like an atom has action and reaction, except those powers are slightly greater. There is a free will, and the free will can cause the self to do whatever it wants. And by wants, I mean it can will things to happen without any external cause, while being informed by consciousness about what the options are. Consciousness gives the options, and the will chooses from between them. Therefore, as a last note, I would just like to say that free will is definitely logically consistent. Now, I haven't given any evidence for why such a thing should exist yet, but it is definitely logically consistent. It's just not consistent with materialism.